We also made an ironclad commitment to bring our prisoners of war home. That's who we are as Americans.
The main concern was that we had to act fast in a delicate situation that required no publicity.
President Obama started out last weekend celebrating the prisoner swap for Bowe Bergdahl, but by Friday he was being forced to defend the decision and his failure to notify Congress. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Syndicated columnist George Will, Mara Liasson from National Public Radio, Steve Hayes of the Weekly Standard, and Fox News political analyst Juan Williams. Well, George, this was always going to be tricky. How do you defend releasing, making a prisoner swap for a soldier who walked away from his post, at the very least, deserted, one could argue, at the most? But as you look back over this week, how did it become such a mess for the administration?
First, by doing it in the Rose Garden, by making it a moment of mellow national celebration, when in fact it was surrounded with ambiguities that were bound to come out sooner or later. So if this had been announced as part of the tidying up at the end of conflict in Afghanistan, that would have been one thing. Then they began by saying, the president just said, time was of the essence. Well, time was of the essence supposedly because a video, 5-month-old video, showed that his health was in immediate peril.
Which they first saw back in January.
Correct. That's it. So 5 months ago they said this. Mr. Hagel repeated, Secretary Hagel repeated that he was in peril. Dianne Feinstein said there's no evidence, no reason whatever to believe that. So you had conflict from the start. It looks as though there were two other motives here for the administration, policy motives. One is if you can get rid of the 5 worst offenders at Guantanamo, it makes it easier to close Guantanamo because the rest seems minor and trivial. And this third is that this was an attempt to reach out to the moderates in the Taliban. I'll leave it up to you to decide if that's an oxymoron, but it's back to Cold War thinking. We were always trying to propitiate the moderates in the Kremlin so that the hawks in the Kremlin, we try and manipulate our enemies, sometimes to not very demonstrable effect. But that's what happened. We had a plethora of reasons, none of which seemed satisfactory.
We asked you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Facebook from Jim Handy. He writes, when is the president going to invite the families of those killed looking for Bergdahl to the Rose Garden? Mara, you spent a lot of time covering the White House. Do they realize how tone-deaf, even offensive, the Rose Garden ceremony was, and how do they explain it?
You know, a lot of Democrats I've talked to agree that the Rose Garden was a mistake. They should have made a statement. The strong and silent approach would have been better. But when you talk to the White House, they said they had to do it. The president was leaving the next day. The parents just happened to be in town, which is true. They were here for Memorial Day. The parents have been in regular contact with White House officials for years. And they decided to do this. They said the president had to own this decision. It was his. I also think that, as in many cases before, they just overspin things, try to milk too much benefit for the president out of it. They knew it was going to be controversial. And I think that of all people, Harry Reid, who usually isn't considered a great communicator, I think said it better than President Obama did. It doesn't matter if he was sick or his health was in danger. It doesn't matter the circumstances of his departure. We had to get him back. Those are the firmest grounds for the president to stand on. I did it because we leave no one behind, period.
Steve, the White House has taken to summarizing the president's foreign policy as don't do stupid stuff, although they use another word for stuff. Did they do stupid stuff this week?
Yeah, I think the real problem here, I mean, I agree with you that the Rose Garden announcement was tone deaf. There are all sorts of problems with the sort of atmospherics here. The problem is the substance. The problem here is the administration's case about Bowe Bergdahl has fallen apart. The administration's case about these Guantanamo detainees has fallen apart. It's very clear that there are not minor conflicts between the story that the administration sold, but the story that the intelligence officials have provided in classified briefings and elsewhere. As George pointed out, the health issues that the administration made front and center, their first arguments about Bowe Bergdahl, Secretary Hagel said, we had to save his life. based on this video from 5 months ago, you have Dianne Feinstein and Director of National Intelligence James Clapper saying there's no intelligence to support that claim. Then on the Guantanamo detainees, you have the same thing. You have the administration certifying that these are no longer a threat to U.S. national security, that this isn't a problem. And yet, you have in private briefings the National Intelligence Officer for South Asia testifying that 4 out of 5 of them are likely, nearly certain to go back to fighting again. You have James Clapper, again, in private testimony, this is not what he and the administration is saying in public, saying, in effect, these guys are going to go back and fight. We're returning fighters to the enemy, not fighters, but commanders to the enemy while the war is still going on. That's the problem.
Juan, you like to take the other side in these discussions. Is there any part of how this has been handled and the actual substance of the decisions that you want to defend?
I don't think it's a matter of defending, Chris. I think it's a matter of us as Americans not getting lost in the, I think, troubling optics of the White House ceremony. Or, you know, Steve Hayes does a great job of reporting on all this stuff, but I think it's, again, you can't get lost in the fog for the key, very clear principle. The clear principle is we don't leave soldiers behind. And at the moment, I think what's necessary here, I'm reminded this Sunday morning of the story of the prodigal son, that you don't make judgments as you have the opportunity to bring that child back. America should be loving this child at this moment. Obviously, we don't know why he left. We think he's a troubled person. We think he may have lost a sense of America's mission. All true. But the idea is we don't leave people in the enemy's hands. The enemy saw him as an American soldier. That young man suffered. He was caged, Chris. His parents suffered, and yet people want to argue about the father's beard. They want to say they shouldn't have a parade. Let the military decide. The military is best positioned, not us sitting here on this panel, and not all the political people on the Republican side who have flip-flopped, Chris, in the most craven way. Unbelievable.
No.
Yeah, we got to bring
the details of
Bergdahl
this
back
matter.
in any way we
They
can.
didn't flip-flop. The details of this really matter. The details of these Guantanamo detainees, even if you accept the principle, I think you made the case very well, you accept the principle that we want to bring everybody back, the details of this transfer matter. These 5 guys, that makes this, I think, very difficult for some of the people who wanted to bring Bergdahl back in theory, very difficult for them to swallow. And on your second point, look, I think you're right. There are some people who have jumped to conclusions here and want to say that he was an enemy collaborator, and we know this right now. We don't know that. But at the same time, if you look at what we heard from his squad mates, they said that, you know, there were intelligence reports immediately that he had sought out the Taliban. Those guys in the field by themselves they don't have a choice. They can't sit here and think about, you know, whether we should treat him as a prodigal son, we should think about him this way, we should love him as much as we can. Their you-know-whats were on the line as they went after him to try to recover him. They can't think of this as theoretical. They heard that he went out and sought out the Taliban. They've got to regard him in that way.
Steve, you and I operate in life as friends, and we got each other's back. But I'm going to tell you something. Those young men are operating in a way that's different than the military. The military never designated Bergdahl as a deserter, AOL, or dishonorable. In fact, he was promoted while he was absent, and he was treated as an American being held as a prisoner of war.
George, you want to get in? Final thought.
Well, I do. We're all accepting the principle that we leave no one behind. But no principle trumps every other consideration. Every principle must have a limiting principle. Now, if these 5 were a proportionate exchange for Mr. Bergdahl, why not 10? Why not 20? What else are we saying? I mean, because if we go to the Taliban and say, absolutely a principle we will not violate, they'll say, well, good, we can ratchet up the price indefinitely.
All right. We have to leave it there, but we are going to continue the conversation.